works, I'm going to go, obviously. I'm not going to...
Yeah.
If there are any questions about dissertation or anything else, you can just
Yeah.
throw them to me.
Sure.
We have places for all the workshops at the moment.
Okay. Yeah.
So that might be something that comes up. But other than that, yeah.
Cool. Okay. And then for the ones next week, it was both of 50 spaces.
Yeah,
Is that right?
they have.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I've got the link on there, so I can direct them to.
And the 5 o'clock lecture is somewhere else. You know that, right?
Yeah. The Safra.
Safra
Safra
the
ones.
It's very horizontal. Like you don't know where you're looking because it's a flat lecture.
Is that in the?
It's King's. It's
over in the. Yeah.
It's one floor below the cafeteria, I think.
Oh, it's the one down there. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Cool.
Then.
Cheers, Ralph. I'll see you later. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, 新年快乐 to all our Chinese students. Thank you. Yes, happy Chinese New Year. My name is Pete Chonker. I'm a teaching fellow in the Digital Humanities Department. Some of you know me. I know some of you. That's great. Some of you I don't. Welcome. So this is... over the last couple of weeks, you've had introductory dissertation preparation sessions with Rafal, who's in charge of the dissertation module. Today, this is the first preparation lecture where we start to talk about methods and methodology, the ways in which you are going to gather data, primary data, in order to answer the research questions that you have posed for your dissertations. And of course, the big difference between your usual coursework in DDH for your modules and the dissertation is the fact that for the dissertation you are expected to do some form of primary research, and you're not generally expected to do that for your coursework. And so in order to do this primary research, you are going to be going out into the world and gathering data. And we're going to start to talk today about some of the ways in which you can gather data, and we'll be focusing on interviews, focus groups, and different forms of ethnography as an introduction to this. And then in subsequent weeks, in subsequent lectures, you're going to be looking at other types of data collection, other methods. So what we're going to do today, we're going to start off by thinking a bit about methods and methodology, and crucially the difference between methods and a methodology. And then I'm going to sort of introduce the concept of research ethics in terms of principles of research ethics, and then the particular procedures that you're going to have to go through insofar as they relate to the methods that I'm going to talk about today. And those methods, as I said, are interviews, firstly. So we're going to talk about why you might choose to do interviews, to use interviews as a research method. Who would you do an interview with? And all of the kind of the practicalities of where would I do an interview? How would I do it? You know, what would I do to record it and transcribe it, etc. And what would I do with my data after I've conducted an interview, because the analysis of interview or focus group data is an important part of this process. We're going to talk about focus groups and what the difference between interviews and focus groups are. And then we're going to talk about ethnographies and different types of offline and online ethnographies, or participant observation, as these type of methods are sometimes called. And then we're going to conclude by, I'll highlight a few things that you should be thinking about in preparation for your methodology, and things that are going to be useful to you potentially over the coming weeks and months. So we're going to cram a lot of stuff in today. I hope there'll be a little bit of time left at the end for questions, but we'll see. But let's get cracking. Okay, thinking about methods and methodology. I guess the central point that has to be emphasized in any of our discussions about methods, and you're going to be having these over the next few weeks, is the fact that it is your research question that determines your method. It's not an idea of a method that you want to use that determines your research question. You start with your research question, and your research question will give you an idea of what you want to know, what you want to find out. That's the answer to your research question for a dissertation. And once you know what you want to find out, you can then think, well, what is the best way that I can gather data to find this out? And this is where we come to methods, because a method essentially is a tool. That's why there's a picture of a big hammer on the slide. You don't usually need a hammer to do an interview. That's not been my experience anyway. But an interview is a method, and we can think about a method being a tool in order to gather data. And it's your research question that drives the methods that you choose. Okay? And you are going to be introduced to a wide range of different methods over the coming weeks. You may use one of those methods. You may use a combination of these different methods. You might take what's referred to as a mixed methods approach. You might actually do something different as well, but there are other methodologies that you might engage with. But fundamentally, research questions drive your methods. At the most basic level, as I'm sure you guys are already aware, there is a distinction we can draw between quantitative and qualitative data collection. Quantitative data collection, quantitative methods rely on gathering data that is countable, that is quantifiable. The classic example of this is survey data collection. And you're going to talk in detail about surveys in a few weeks with Daniel. Qualitative data collection involves methods that gather information that is arguably richer, more contextual, subjective, based on kind of personal experiences, emotions, analysis of sentiment within text, discourse within texts or within interview data. The stuff that you can't count, right? And that's what makes it qualitative data collection. And all of the methodologies, the 3 and arguably 4 methodologies that we'll be discussing today, are all qualitative methods: interviews, focus groups, and different kinds of ethnography. Now, I've explained what methods are. We can look at methods as a tool to gather data. What's the difference then between a method and a methodology? Well, the methodology in your dissertation is the section of your dissertation, the chapter, however you want to call it, a good several thousand words, that talks about and reflects on and justifies the choice of methods that you have made, that you have used in order to answer your research question. Your methodology is not simply, oh, for this study I decided to do interviews, next section. No, your methodology explains, well, why did you choose interviews as a way of researching your particular topic? Who did you actually interview? Why did you choose these people? What was the process by which you went out to find these interviewees? What type of questions did you ask them and why? How did it go? Did you experience any problems in designing this plan of research? Did you experience any problems in actually doing the research? Because we always experience problems doing research, that's a given, right? And then we have to think about how we plan for those problems, and then in the methodology we write about how we try to overcome those problems. And so this methodology is a reflection, a critical, self-reflexive discussion of what methods you chose, why you chose them, and how the process of research went. Because whatever we study, and this is something I always emphasize to students, whatever our research question is, whatever our topic is, there is never a perfect methodology. Methodologies always have limitations and drawbacks. There is no such thing as a perfect methodology. Now, some people might disagree with me with that, but I would insist that I'm right. There is no perfect methodology, and therefore, in your methodology section, you have to be honest and self-critical about where these limitations were and how you did your best to overcome them, and why your choice of methods was sensible, why it made sense, and why it generated data that is reliable, that allows you to answer your research question, which is what you do for the rest of your dissertation. Okay. It's important to, you might have heard kind of people talk about research ethics. These would have come up in literature that you read as part of your course. But now you are going off out into the world to do primary research. Questions of ethics and the principles that lie behind research ethics become particularly important. And these are principles that we apply to any research that we do, but the actual procedures that we have to go through at King's, as staff doing research, as students doing research, are going to be different depending on which particular methods you choose. But it's a good idea to kind of familiarize ourselves with some of the basic principles that guide our discussion of research ethics. The first principle relates to this notion of safeguarding, and safeguarding the interests of all persons involved with the research. Safeguarding means protecting people from any kind of harm that might result from the conduct of research. And when we talk about all persons, we are talking about the people who participate in the research. So, for example, the people that you interview, or the people who are part of a focus group, or the people you observe. We're also thinking about the people who you are writing about, who are maybe not participants in the research, but maybe subjects of the research, the people that you are studying, the particular group. Importantly, very importantly, this also includes the safety and the interests of you as the researcher. You are primarily involved in your research, and part of this idea of safeguarding involves not putting yourself in a position that's going to cause you problems or expose you to undue risk. So that's what we mean when we talk about the safeguarding of all persons involved with the research. Another sort of fundamentally important principle here relates to the notion of informed consent. Now, as the researcher, you have informed consent because you're the one that's doing the research. But in terms of the people who are participating, again, your interviewees, the people that you are observing, etc., these people need to give their informed consent, they need to understand what you are doing, right? Researchers are not secret agents involved in undercover espionage type observation of people and society. We have to be transparent in our research, and people simply need to understand that you are a master's student at King's College London, and that you are writing a dissertation, and as part of that dissertation you are gathering data from them as participants in the research. They need to have an idea of what the purpose of your study is in order for them to be able to give informed consent to take part as interviewees or to respond to a survey. And they need to have some kind of guarantee that their privacy will be respected, and that there will be a level of confidentiality that is defined by the researcher and the participant, and that is clear to everyone who is involved. And we'll talk about that more specifically in relation to things like interviews later in the lecture. Another important principle of research ethics, which actually often gets overlooked but relates to informed consent, is the idea that people who participate in the research have the possibility or the option to be informed about the results of that research. Right? So a classic way of doing this is if you are doing an interview with someone, you say to them, you know, can I contact you after I have completed the research to share with you my dissertation, because you might be interested in it, right? If you want, I can share the results. People, of course, might say, no, I'm not bothered, right? Fine, whatever. That's their prerogative. But giving people the option to have access to the results and to read what's come out of this research, I think, is very, very important. So feedback of research results is an ethical principle that we should think about. We also have to think carefully about who is participating in our research, the different circumstances that people might be in, and the different levels of vulnerability that people might be characterized by or might experience. There is a difference in using different, and using is not the right word, engaging with different types of research participant in your research process. And as students doing the dissertation in the department, it's going to be unlikely that the University Ethics Board is going to allow you as students with fairly limited experience of doing primary research to engage with people who might be described as vulnerable. So in terms of research with children, people under the age of, particularly under the age of 16, potentially also under the age of 18. People from in particular contexts, people who might be considered to be marginalized, for various kind of social, political, cultural reasons in different places. Refugee populations, for example, people who are in a war zone, you are going to find it difficult to gain the research clearance to talk to those types of people. So that's something that you should bear in mind from the beginning, thinking about your own research questions and your own interests. If you are interested in so-called vulnerable populations, there may be ways to study those contexts and those people that don't involve direct human interaction with those people as research participants. So it doesn't mean those kind of questions are off the table, but it might affect the particular type of interviews that you are able to get ethical clearance for in order to do. But I'm going to talk about the procedures for this now. Your methodology in your dissertation is one of the places that you talk about, or is the primary place where you talk about research ethics. And you should be drafting your research methodology over the coming months, and usually supervisors, who I know you haven't got your supervisors yet, have you? No. That will be happening very soon because you've submitted the abstracts. Supervisors will expect you to submit a draft methodology to them around April time for them to read and for them to comment on. And that's the place where you start to talk about ethical concerns as well as your broader choices of methods. As part of that process, if you were choosing to do interviews or focus groups or surveys, you would be expected as part of that deadline to share your interview plans or your survey questions with your supervisor around this same time, so they can give you feedback on the type of things that you want to ask, raise any relevant issues, or discuss any ethical considerations with them. Your supervisor, through this process, will advise you the so-called level of risk that your research entails. And there are basically 3 levels of risk that are assigned by the Research Ethics Committee at King's. For projects that are deemed to be minimal risk, what you as a student have to do by the 15th of May 2019 is to register your project. So if it's defined, and again, you will be guided on this by your supervisor, and also there's kind of self-checklist type documents in these links here, which will give you a sense of whether your project is deemed to be minimal risk. Usually a minimal risk project is one that doesn't have direct contact with human research participants. And for that, you just have to register the project. If your project is deemed to be low risk, which is the sort of the step beyond, you would need to go through the online application process, which is the same deadline, the 15th of May. You need to submit the form, and that is looked at by the Research Ethics Committee, and they will either sign off on it and say, yes, that's fine, go for it, or they would maybe say, you need to look at this a bit more carefully, maybe you need to change this, etc. That would be for a low-risk project, and that process is ongoing, but the department for the deadline is the 15th of May. It's very unlikely that you are going to be able to do any project for your MA dissertation that's classified as a high-risk project. And again, your supervisor will advise on that. So you're either going to be registering your project, or you are going to be applying for clearance for a low-risk research project. Okay. Right, so let's move on to thinking about these actual methods and focusing first on interviews. And the first question that you should be asking yourself is, should I consider using interviews as a research method? Well, as I emphasized from the beginning, that depends very much on your research question. It depends on the type, the kind of data that you want to gather in order to answer that question. Interviews in general are used to gather qualitative data, as I emphasized from the beginning, usually in-depth data or detailed information about particular things relating to your research question. Often we use interviews to talk to people about their experiences of different contexts, of different types of activities, of their social lives, their professional lives, what they think and feel about certain topics or issues, or in a very detailed fashion, what they do. What their emotions are, right? These are all things that are very difficult to quantify accurately through surveys, right? I mean, methodologically, I'm always very distrustful of those surveys that ask you to, kind of rate your level of happiness, your level of life satisfaction, right? I got a call from my old university the other day that wanted to do a life satisfaction survey with me over the phone to see how happy I was as a graduate of their particular PhD program. And it asked me, and this woman lover on the phone, she's asking me to rate my level of happiness from a scale of 1 to 10, and I just thought it was completely nonsensical, right? And I tried to joke with her, but she had a very set form that she had to ask each question from and put a numerical value on these things. And I don't think that's a very useful way of getting a sense of where people are and what people feel. And interviews give the opportunity to get detailed, subjective, rich data about people's thoughts and feelings and experiences, things that are much more difficult to gain particularly from quantitative methods. So think about your research question, think about what you want to know from people, and start to think about that as a consideration. So the next question relates to who do you actually want to interview? And there's, I mean, in very generally speaking, there's kind of two ways that we can approach that. We can think about, firstly, what's the particular population? What's the particular group of people that I'm interested in my research? So am I interested in young migrant workers in the hospitality industry in London, for example? Am I interested in software developers who work in AI engineering in London or something, right? Is there a particular, am I interested in the experience of young British people? You know, is there a particular population that I'm interested in? And would it be possible for me to develop a sample that is representative of that particular population in terms of age, in terms of background, in terms of profession, in terms of location? Arguably, doing the type of research that you're doing and with the time limitations that you have, if you take a very big population as your group that you are interested in, it's going to be difficult for you to build a sample of interviews that is going to be sufficient, right? If you're interested in what British people think, and you are able to conduct interviews with 20 British people between now and June or something, 20 people out of a population of 65 million is not going to be representative of anything, right? And you could not claim that. I mean, and the same, in a sense, would go for survey research that you're going to talk about with Daniel. Although with survey research, you would have the capacity to talk to a larger number of people, but probably not something that's going to be representative of a population. So in this kind of thinking about a sample, this makes much more sense if there's a specific group of people who you can identify, who you are interested in, and a significant proportion of them that you can talk about. But time limitations are going to be particularly important for you because you don't have very much time in preparing these dissertations. What's probably a more realistic way of approaching this is to think about what's referred to as key informant interviews. When we talk about key informant interviews, we're talking about interviewing particular individuals who are somehow directly related to your research question. They have a particular experience or a particular knowledge that is relevant and you can demonstrate is relevant to what you want to study. So, for example, you are doing research on a particular startup tech company in London. Typical startup, not that many people, and you might have access to these people. You might be able to contact these people. You might be able to talk to the CEO of a small startup, right? You might be able to talk to someone who does marketing. These are key informant interviewees in the sense that they have very specific knowledge that's directly related to your research question. They are a key informant. What they have to say is important and a different type of knowledge than you might be able to get from other types of interviewees. So the key informant interview is potentially a more realistic way to think about this. So consider this in relation to your research topic and your research questions. A big question, a big practical question is, well, how do you actually go about finding interviewees? It's perfectly valid to use your own social networks in order to contact people. in order to find people and see if they're willing to talk to you. Again, this is going to depend on your research questions. It's going to depend on what you're interested in doing your research in, and who you know, and who's a friend of a friend, etc. But it's perfectly valid to use your own social networks, and that might have an influence on what you actually want to study. If you have a particular way into a certain industry or a certain context or a certain issue. Often people talk about snowball sampling. Snowball sampling is this idea of a snowball that rolls down a hill, right? As snowballs roll down the hill, they get bigger and bigger, right? That's the analogy. The idea here is that you find someone to interview, right? You get an interview with the person who does marketing for this particular startup company, right? And that person, you do the interview with them, and it goes well, and you ask them, oh, do you know anyone else who does a similar job for a similar company who I might be able to contact? And that person puts you in touch with someone else who is also relevant, not just some random other person, but someone who you can also justify is relevant to your particular study. This is the idea of snowball sampling, that one interviewee can potentially open the door to another one. And this often happens in terms of key informant interviews, right? You speak to one journalist and they refer you to another journalist, etc., etc., etc. So that again is a perfectly valid way of identifying key informants and having the contacts that allow you to open the doors to talk to people, right? It's often much more difficult as just some anonymous students in a big institution like King's just approaching people out of the blue, particularly people who are busy, right? Who might not have time to, give their time for interviews. But if you can get personal introductions, personal connections from people that you've already talked to, this can open a lot of doors. And that's a perfectly valid way of gaining more interviewees. Don't be afraid to try to make direct contact with key informants, right? But be realistic, right? If you're doing research on Facebook, sending Mark Zuckerberg an email request or a friend request probably isn't going to get you very far, right? Unless you've got the particular social networks that opens that door for you. Who knows? We might have a Mark Zuckerberg relative in the audience today. But it's unlikely, right? So be realistic about who is going to reply to your emails, who is going to be responsive to direct contact. But at the same time, don't be afraid to contact people. And think carefully about how you explain to them what research you are doing, that you are very clear. This again relates to informed consent, that you're a student, you're doing this particular research on this particular topic. It's always a good idea to flatter people when you approach them, right? I know from your work that you are an incredibly, no, don't never say incredibly, an important person in this field, and I, benefit from your insight, etc. So don't be afraid to make direct contact with people. What's the worst that can happen? They don't reply, right? That's usually the worst that can happen. So, be bold in your approach, but also be realistic about who's actually going to get back to you. Another method that sometimes people use, and this would form part of a mixed method study, is to use surveys as an initial way to gather data from a particular group of people, and then using that survey and using the people who have responded to that survey, give those people an option to maybe leave their email address to say, if you would be willing to do a follow-up interview about the results of this survey, please leave your email address and I might contact you. Okay? That's a way of identifying a group of people, gathering an initial set of data, probably quantitative data, stuff that's easy to get from a survey, but then following up with interviews in a more in-depth fashion with some of those people, maybe to pursue points that came up from the survey data that you have gained. Now, there's always a level of bias in the sampling for sampling in that way, because certain types of people are going to be more receptive to, having sort of follow-up research. So you might have to consider that. But again, that's a valid way of engaging with people and a practical way potentially to contact people about certain questions. And that's what we refer to as mixed methods. More practicalities. Once you've made contact, once you've set up an interview, you need to think about where you're actually going to do the interview. Be flexible. It's highly likely, particularly for key informant interviews, that you have to go to people, right? You go to their place of work, right? Go to their offices to talk. You might consider inviting people to a public place, right? To a cafe, as a public setting, somewhere that's open, that you can sit down and have a cup of coffee with someone and conduct an interview. But be practical again here. Think about what type of places are appropriate for interviews and what are not. Consider how much space you have, how noisy the environment is, how accessible it is for people, and those kind of things. If you're doing focus groups, you might consider booking a university room to do that. You have access to the room. Students have access to room booking systems at King's. So for a group interview like a focus group, you might be able to book space like that. But again, think about practicalities in organising this. In the actual interview, gaining informed consent is extremely important before you start the interview. And this may include specific consent that the person gives you to record the interview. Never record interviews in secret, right? If you're going to record an interview, which is a very good idea, make sure that is very obvious and very clear. There are different ways of gaining people's consent. The important thing is that you have a record of it, right? That people consent on tape. I'm happy, I give my consent that I'm being recorded, or they sign a particular consent form, the templates of which will be made available to you, which you can download and adapt based on your own particular research. You might consider, well, you have to think about how you will refer to your interviewees when you write this data up, when you use this data in your dissertations. It might be data that is about a very uncontroversial subject. Your research participants, particularly key informants, might be very willing for their name to be used fully in the research. You know, Jack Ma of Alibaba told me that. If you get that interview, you know, and they want to put their name out. They want to be visible. And they're not saying anything that's controversial, and they'd be happy for them to be used nominally in that interview. Other people might not. You might be talking about different types of subjects, more controversial subject matter, and people might want to be anonymized. You might want to give people different names. If it doesn't matter that someone's name is given or not, and if people are not bothered, then it can just make sense to anonymize everyone. Just give everyone a pseudonym if it doesn't make a difference to your to the way you write up your data. The crucial thing here is that you ask participants about this and ask them simply, can I name you in the interview? Can I use this data but give you a different name, anonymize you? Of course, you might get to the end of the interview and the interviewee might say, actually, sorry, I don't want you to use any of this. Now, that is a nightmare scenario because you've wasted your time, pretty much, but the research participant is perfectly within his or her right to ask you not to use that data, and you have to respect that as a principle of basic research ethics. That sucks, but it doesn't happen often, but it is a possibility, right? Part of informed consent is the ability of a research participant to withdraw from research at any point in time during it. So have that in mind. But the crucial thing is that you give people the option. Do you want me to use your name? Do you want me to make you anonymous? Etc. If you can, best interview practice is to record an interview. You record an interview in order for you to have a record of it. And what you do afterwards is you go away and you listen to that recording and you transcribe it. You transcribe it, which means you write it out. And that is what you use for data analysis. It's perfectly acceptable to conduct interviews in non-English, right? Using your native language, using the native language of the person you are interviewing. It's also perfectly legitimate to transcribe into that language, right? You conduct an interview in Chinese, you transcribe it into Chinese. That's fine, right? Anything you use from the interview, however, anything from the interview that goes into your dissertation is in English, so that part has to be translated into English. But you don't necessarily need to translate your entire transcription. You can do the data analysis on the transcript as long as it's a language that you understand. Transcription takes time. Right? It's a long process, particularly if you do a lot of interviews. Right? It takes time to listen and to write stuff out, as does the data analysis that we'll talk about in a minute. So bear that in mind when you think about the number of interviews that you want to undertake. There's a difference between unstructured, semi-structured and structured interviews. Structured interviews are interviews like the person who called me on the phone from the University of Edinburgh to ask about my level of happiness after graduating. That person had a script and they had to follow every single question, right? That was a structured interview. An unstructured interview is where you just go and sit down with someone and you just sort of start talking, right? Most social science qualitative interviews follow a semi-structured format, where you go into the interview with an idea of the questions that you want to ask, but you can be flexible and the interview may take different directions depending on what the interviewee is saying, right? You want this balance between getting the data that you want and allowing people to speak freely. And this relates to kind of time management, right? You're thinking about how you can get the best out of your interview. You might want to consider grouping your questions into certain themes and making sure that you get at least one or two questions for each theme, so you have a wide-ranging range of responses, even if you don't get to ask every single question. And that's going to depend on who you're interviewing and how much time they have. Avoid leading questions when you are asking questions, right? A leading question is a question that leads an interviewee into a particular answer, that puts an idea in his or her head, right? A leading question would be, talking about something, does this make you angry? A non-leading question around a similar issue would be, how does this make you feel? How does this make you feel as a question is much more open-ended. It doesn't imply that the interviewee should feel angry about this particular issue. It gives a wider range of possibilities for response. There's a great cheesy 80s video that's in the link here. These slides should be up on Keats, by the way. If Raphael hasn't already put them up, he will put them up. There's a great cheesy link here to a video from the 80s of sort of social science interviews, which draws on Cavallet's different characteristics of a good interviewer or a good interviewer. So an interviewer who is knowledgeable about the topic, who has structure to what they are actually undertaking, they're clear in their questions, they're gentle, sensitive, open, but they steer to particular topics when that's necessary. They're critical in an interview, thinking critically about what people are saying and adapting and pushing interviewees potentially when that's necessary. They remember what was already said and they are able to interpret this. We've got specific interview workshops that I'm running next week, which I'll give you details of, and we'll talk about this in more detail then. But watch the video, it's quite a good one. Okay, we're running out of time. Focus groups. Focus groups are more than just a group interview. Sometimes people look at focus groups as kind of a shortcut, right? I don't have much time and I want to speak to lots of people, so let's put them all in one room together, right? That's not the logic or the rationale that you should be using for a focus group. A focus group is different from an interview because what you're interested in a focus group is watching, hearing, and seeing how people interact and discuss a topic, right? People's interaction, difference of opinions, group dynamics in terms of a discussion about a particular topic is why you do a focus group. You do have the same kind of considerations about balancing kind of structure and flexibility because you have time constraints in a focus group as you do for an interviewer, and you want to think carefully about your rationale for choosing different types of participants. People from all of the same backgrounds, people from different backgrounds but talking about the same issue. Those are things that you can relate to your particular research question and the particular data that you want. In focus groups, it's often a really good idea to provide prompts for people, giving the group material to talk about, a particular image, right? A particular article, something from social media, something that people can look at and discuss and interact with you and with each other about. That's also potentially good practice in an interview, again, depending on what you're interested in particular. After you've done your interview, as I said, you transcribe your recordings and then you undertake analysis of these recordings. This is something I'm going to speak about in more detail next week in the research, in the workshops for interviews. But basically what this involves generally is coding your interview for different themes. You're looking to pull out the important data from your interview transcripts that relates to what other people have said and relates to your understanding of the general kind of discussion of this topic. And so you think about your themes and your codes in terms of your research question and the bits that you are really interested in and different sections. And there are various kind of practical ways that we can go about doing this. Printing everything out and using highlighter pens and post-it notes is a perfectly acceptable analog way to do things. But there are also particular software packages for qualitative data analysis that you can use. NVivo is one of the most commonly used tools, and I found out that as students you do have access to this. You can download the license. And NVivo, there's also training available in the library, but it's basically software that allows you to input text and then create a set of codes and then apply those codes to the text, what the interviewer says, what Barry says, etc., and then use that to visualize and collate and report on your data in different ways. An interesting alternative is something called Deduze, which I think is a much easier, simpler user interface, but you'd have to pay for that one. You have to pay a monthly subscription for that, but it is quite user-friendly, and it's pretty cheap, actually. It's about $10, £6 or £7 a month for a student subscription, so it's one to look at. But there's just some links there that you could follow if you're interested in those, but I'll talk about them in more detail in the workshops next week. Okay, ethnographies. Ethnographic research is different from interviews or Facebook. Facebook? Oh my God, it's been a long day. Focus groups, because you are observing society from the point of view of the subject of study. Clifford Geertz, who was an anthropologist, and this is a methodology that is most commonly associated with anthropology and sociology, described ethnography, doing ethnography or ethnographic research as deep hanging out. For Geertz, this deep hanging out was about being in situations where people were doing things. He was interested in cockfighting in Indonesia. He wrote lots of fascinating anthropological observations about what cockfights mean in Indonesian society back in the 60s and 70s. You're probably not doing research on that, but you never know. But what this is watching, doing, reflecting, analysing in a way that allows you to give, again, what Goetz calls thick description of a social context. Right? If someone was doing an ethnography of us now, of this social setting, this lecture, and there might be, I don't know, there might be an ethnographer in here making notes, they would be observing what is happening in this room. They wouldn't simply be recording the content of my slides. They would be looking at the social dynamics of this room, where I stand, what you guys are doing. Are you paying attention? Everyone's on their phone? Or, are you listening? What type of language do I use? How am I engaging with you? They would describe that. They would describe this as a social setting. And being in the room, they would be a participant observer of this. And so they would be taking notes and they would write about this, and this would be a form of ethnography. Should you consider this as a methodology? I haven't had time to give it appropriate detail here, but you might think about, is my research question related to a particular place or space, a particular social practice that I might be able to observe and be in and watch people using technology or talking about technology. This brings us finally to the notion of digital ethnography, or netnography as it's sometimes called, which applies the same kind of basic approach of participant observation, but to cyberspace, to online spaces. There are some differences here, obviously, in terms of the contextual or structural complexities of platforms, cyberspaces, which influence how people communicate, and that has to be kind of considered when doing this. But there are various kind of cyber communities, obviously, as we know from studying in DDH, that it might be possible to act as a participant observer in. And this also raises particular ethical questions about the transmissibility of data and anonymity, because as we know, social media spaces are often highly public, and it can be easy for a researcher to insert themselves, but what are the ethical norms around announcing yourself as a researcher? What happens when people are interacting in what is a public space, but they actually do so in a way that is quite private, or they consider the space to be private, right? These are questions that people are still kind of grappling with because this is such a new method, but I've included various kind of links here and the reference to Kozinet's netnography book, if this is something that you would like to consider. Brittany Kelly in the department, some of you know Brittany, I'm sure. She taught a whole module this year on ethnographies and digital ethnographies. So she would be a great person in the department to talk about when it comes to issues like this. So she did a whole module on it. I've done 5 minutes on it. So it's a big topic, but she might be a good person to approach about that. Okay, just to conclude, I emphasised from the beginning, your research questions guide your choice of methods and not the other way round. What you should be doing now is, once you have settled on a particular topic and a particular research question, if you think interviews are going to be an appropriate method, because they might not be, right? They're not for everyone, they're not for every research question, you might want to start thinking about an initial interviewee list and start thinking about the type of questions you would ask different people. My advice at the moment is use your time with supervisors. You have 6 hours of contact time with your supervisors, so that's potentially 6-hour-long meetings. Use your time at this stage to talk to them about methods, right? We are all social science researchers. We have all used these methods, maybe not all of them. We have different specialties and different methods, but we've done this stuff, we've encountered problems, etc. Talk to us as supervisors about this, because we've all been there. And then the final thing to flag here is that, as I've said before, next week At the same time, next Friday from 2 to 3 and then 5 to 6, I will be doing designing and interview study workshops, which are going to be more practical, coming back to some of the things that we've raised here, looking at your individual projects in small groups and talking about how you might go about designing an interview study. So what I've done today is given you an overview of some of these methods. If you think that interviews might be for you, then you're welcome to come to these sessions. You have to sign up via Eventbrite, but I'm told by Raphael that there's still lots of places on these, so follow those links. Does anyone have any questions really quickly? I don't think we have much time. So if you do have questions, then come to the workshops. Thank you very much. Cheers. Do you want the screen on?
Yeah. Thank you. Your cup?
Yeah.